All right, welcome to another episode of Sum Shenanigans, a series that is designed to provide you with tangible teaching tips that you can implement in your classroom. I am one of your hosts. My name is Adam. I'm a professional learning specialist at CPM, and I am joined today by my wonderful co-host.
I'm Bri. I'm also a professional learning specialist at CPN and former high school math teacher, just like Adam. So excited to be
So
here
much,
again.
so much fun, wasn't it? High school.
I love high schoolers and I miss them dearly.
They have their moments, right?
I do. We really do.
Alrighty, so today we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump right into our topic, which is going to be about pacing. Now, it's really one of those things that can give teachers a really bad headache, right?
Absolutely.
And I think what makes pacing such a nightmare sometimes is that it's one of those teaching things, it's one of those things that's part of our classroom that is affected by so many factors
Mhm.
outside of our classroom, whether it's from administrators or the school site's schedule, things like that. Um, at least for me, it sometimes would keep me up at night, late at night, trying to figure out like how am I going to fit all of these things, these lessons, and all of that into the classroom and make it work. So
Mhm.
our goal for today is we want to be able to give you some advice and some recommendations about how you can manage pacing for your classroom. So I'm going to kick it over to you for a little bit, Bree. Like when you think about pacing and you think about your classroom experience and how you did pacing and all the considerations there, what are some things that stand out to you?
Well, I'll start by saying, like, you're totally right. Pacing kind of reminds me of just the overall question that you sort of ask yourself as a teacher is how can I do it all? Right? How can I fit it all in, whether it's on a day to day basis, you're just trying to get through the month or semester. Um, and you're absolutely right. Like that pacing stress, like it doesn't just come from our own planning, it comes from all of the external pressures that we're juggling too. Uh, so when I think about my own classroom experience, I remember constantly asking myself things like, how am I going to get through this entire course? Right? How am I going to get through every chapter? How am I going to get through every problem and finish this lesson? Or, is it okay to skip around this book? Or should I stick to the order of things? Right. All on top of how I'm going to fit everything into class period with all of the other things constantly going on. Right. I love I love high schoolers. I love being in a high school, but it is so overstimulating, right? There's so much going on, and you're constantly just trying to move forward with so much going on. So, um, today we're going to break down pacing into three parts, right? So, we hope to sort of look at it through three different lenses in a way that just maybe helps it feel a little more manageable, right? So, we're going to talk about lesson pacing, and then we'll shift into chapter pacing and then zoom out a little bit and look at semester pacing to give you some tangible tips that you can use for each one. So, Adam, I'm going to ask you to kick us off. When it comes to lesson pacing, what's one thing that you always keep in mind?
So my recommendation for pacing out a lesson is to use timers. That's kind
Mhm.
of like it wasn't it was something that I was really against early on in my teaching career. Like I don't have time for timers, like ironically, right? Um, and it's just I don't know, there was just this to me, right? This is like an Adam thing. There's just this stigma about timers. Like I don't use timers in any other aspect of my life, right? Like so why would I use it in the classroom? But once I started using timers, it was one of those like teacher changing things, right?
Mhm.
And really what it helped with was making sure I got to get to all the components of my lesson plan.
Mhm.
So I wanted a launch, I wanted a time for students to explore, and then I wanted a some time for closure. And so by setting timers, it really helped keep me on pace to make sure that launch didn't go from 5 minutes to 25 minutes and to make sure that explore time was, enough to get into the problems and to work it out, but that it also left time for closure, right? Those 10-ish minutes. So my recommendation when pacing is get your lesson plan out, um, time it all out as best as you can, and then set timers. Nowadays we have phones, or I've seen teachers use like the Google timer and
Hmm.
things like that. But start setting those timers, and I think that will help keep you on track as a teacher and help really pace out that lesson to make sure you can get to all the components that you planned.
Love that. Awesome. Yeah, I think you said something that's really important is that timers can feel a little unnatural, but they do help to focus your lesson and focus the pacing. But I think the key to timers too is aiming for some balance, and using them strategically. Um, I think that sometimes when it comes to timers, and I think Lil Adal might say this too, it we might send some unintentional messages about math being about uh, about speed and moving through things quickly. So I think that balance is really important for timers too. So you might set one for everything, and it might not be student facing, right? So, I know in my classroom, I had timers going all the time, and I tell students, I was transparent, like, "I'm pulling my phone out right now and setting a timer. I've got one going on my watch." And they might not see all of them, but
Mhm.
they're going. And then sometimes it is nice for them to see the timers and say, "Hey, you're gonna work on this problem for 10 minutes, get as far as you can." So, love timers, are a game
Well,
changer.
and I think you bring up a good point about, yeah, we don't want students to feel rushed, right? And we don't want them to feel like they're, there's this time limit on math, right? But the reality of the classroom is we have a time limit. And so I like the balance of, and when you mentioned watch, it brought back like, yeah, I remember setting timers on my watch so that the students didn't need to know, like they didn't need to be this loud buzzing in the classroom, but at least I had some awareness.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think like something, at least a timer, I'll call it a public or a class timer for something like closure, right? Because I do think that the opposite of what you were saying is true. Like we don't want math to feel rushed, but that timer also, in the terms of like closure, could help to signify the importance. Like closure is so important. We are pausing right where, when this timer goes off, we're pausing and we're getting into closure, and you need some time to reflect and synthesize on what you learned and what you talked about during class.
Absolutely. No, I absolutely agree. I think that those student facing uh, timers, you're right. You can use them to help students see what is important, right? Like
Hmm.
every day we are leaving 5 minutes for closure. That reminds me of a colleague who was very clear with his students at the beginning of the year. Um, he would say the first 5 minutes of class is mine. And what he meant by that is there's a non-negotiable of like we have all these things we have to get through in the first 5 minutes, whether attendance, checking homework, managing tardies, and as a teacher, he knew that like we it's critical to get into that lesson launch, right? So starting the class off with those 5 minutes of like moving through those 5 minutes, and at 5 minutes we're starting the lesson launch was super, super important to him. And so he set that expectation. So he used that timer to set an expectation at 5 minutes in, we are launching this lesson, and that 5 minutes is non-negotiable. You're doing your warm up, like you know what you should be doing during that time. So absolutely, it can those timers can help let students know what is important in a class period. So
Yeah. All
awesome.
right. What do you, what were some of your thoughts as you were thinking about pacing a lesson? What were some of the things that you put down?
Well, definitely, timers were something that came to mind for lesson planning. Um, but something else that came to mind, and this might be a little more specific towards CPM teachers, but um, I think for anybody who is using any curriculum, sticking to any identified core problems, that's what we call them in CPM, I think is really helpful, especially during your first year where you're getting to know the curriculum. So, in the CPM curriculum, core problems are those problems that are, we call them the problems that are necessary to meet the lesson objective. So, they're the problems that are sort of designed to get you to the objective, and then every other problem can be seen as an extension. And so sometimes it can be overwhelming to look at a lesson and see, oh, I've got to get through problems 1 through 5. But actually, problems 2 and 4 are supplemental problems, and 1, 3, and 5 are the ones that are going to support that lesson goal. So sticking to those core problems, I think is a just a helpful way to let you breathe a little bit during that first year. Um, I think if you don't have designated core problems, you might look at the problems that you have during the lesson and identify the problems that you think are going to best support that learning goal, or problems that you can formatively assess, and get some insight into where students are at and focus on those. So um, that would be my recommendation, is focus on those core problems. And then to kind of connect to what you were saying, always give yourself time for closure. I think prioritizing closure is actually part of the conversation that, in terms of pacing, because when you prioritize closure and you give students the time to synthesize their learning, see where they're at, and then you get a chance to see where students are at, you're going to be able to move them more along the next day.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
for sure.
so that would be my tip, is to stick to those core problems. So,
Yeah, like you said, for CPM, those problems are already lined out and kind of identified. So they're a little bit easier to know which ones to get through. But regardless, right, CPM or non-CPM, it all comes back to learning target, right? When students walk out of your classroom after that lesson, what do you want them to be able to do, and which problems are going to get them to meet that target? And so I think that's important. CPM or non-CPM, as you're pacing out your lesson, yeah, no, I like that idea of looking at those problems and making sure that the problems you're aiming to get done in the class, like, help students meet that learning target that you have for them.
absolutely
Nice.
right. And I think I always say, everything always goes back to the math goal or the learning target. And so in order to identify that problem, you got to know what your math goal is. You got to know what it is that you want students to be able to walk out with, and what are the indicators or success criteria, whatever you want to call it, um, that will indicate that students left with some understanding. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Nice.
All right. So those are some tips for lesson pacing. At this point, we're going to zoom out a little bit. We're going to talk about chapter pacing. So, Adam, how do you approach pacing when it comes to an entire chapter or unit?
Well, honestly, I found this topic. So we're looking at lesson, chapter, and then semester pacing. I found chapter pacing to kind of be the hardest to think about, because a lot of curriculums seem to have come with like a guide or a recommendation about when to do it and how long it should take and things like that. So it's kind of built into a lot of curriculums.
Mm.
Um, but the one thing I came up with as far as my recommendation for keeping your pacing within a chapter is to remember that students are not going to achieve proficiency in every lesson,
Mm,
right? So we have this amazing lesson, and I've been there. I've been in those shoes where you have this amazing lesson, this amazing goal. This is going to go so amazing. And then you just get this feeling during the explore that the students aren't picking up the learning target, right? And you start to sense like, okay, the learning target I have for them today, it doesn't look like, a lot of the class is going to meet that. So then what do we do? Because now we're often in a crunch, right? Like,
yeah.
do I continue on? Do I pause? Do I make this into a 2-day lesson now when it wasn't meant to be a 2-day lesson, and so on? So I think having that understanding that students, when you're pacing out and you're planning out your chapter, having that understanding that students aren't going to achieve mastery, and then being okay with it and not being afraid to still move on while spiraling back, right? And adopting that mixed space practice approach. Um, if you're a CPM user and you're using core connections or using inspiring connections, a lot of those items are already built in, right? A lot of the topics take 2, 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 days to really get students to chew with that material and let it sit with them and things like that. So a lot of that's built in. But if you're using a different curriculum, and it may be built in, but if it's not, really think about, okay, I want to move on because I have to stick with whatever the pacing is, but how can I give students opportunities to still go back to prior days and prior lessons content and still have practice and still be able to, to work on them. So that would be my kind of big recommendation when planning out a chapter is just to remember that students aren't going to achieve proficiency in every single lesson. And, sometimes you just need to be okay moving on, even though there's not that proficiency, but being able to find ways to still do mixed-based practice throughout.
Absolutely. I think that is such an important reminder. And I think it's something that we have to um, sort of uh, just kind of be reminded about more often is that is that idea that students aren't going to master something every single lesson. And I think that's we need to be reminded of that because it's uncomfortable for us as teachers, right? Like
Yeah.
we want to know that um, students left uh, understanding what they were supposed to, right? And the truth is that each student learns differently, and learning is non-linear, and it's not always going to feel that way. So I appreciate you bringing that up, and that also kind of ties into one of my recommendations that might sort of support that discomfort, which is to plan backwards. Um, so understand, uh, give yourself time to understand where the chapter is going and know what the learning expectations are, right? Because students are going to see a lot of content in a chapter, but they might, like you said, they might not be expected to master every single thing. Some of it might just be exposure for another chapter. Some of it might be something that students do need to be able to show understanding of on a chapter test, right?
Hmm.
Um, but regardless, um, giving yourself time to plan the chapter with the end in mind uh, is super helpful. So, um, my PLC, um, which actually another side recommendation is to just collaborate and check in often when it comes to pacing.
Yeah.
Pacing is something that you actually shouldn't do alone, right? You should do with the
Agree.
team, whether it's your course alike team or even vertical teams. Like this is a conversation that needs to be had throughout so that everybody can support one another because everybody's content kind of depends on one another. Um, but my PLC team, my integrated one team, we met every single Wednesday. And if we were in chapter 2, our meetings really revolved around chapter 3. And we started with that, that end of the chapter assessment. And within the CPM curriculum, we have sample tests for each chapter. So we would start by analyzing those. I know they have those in the CPM second edition. Inspiring Connections also has some sample assessments to help you get some understanding of where the math is going, right? Some other resources, some other CPM resources that might support this are the where is this going section, the checkpoints, and even our content modules help to see how the math is unfolding within each chapter. And backwards planning helps you get a sense of when students do reach mastery, right? Or which skills or ideas they're going to spend more time on. Or maybe there's an idea that they only need to just get exposure to because they're going to dig into it more later, right? So, um, planning with the end in mind. And then also, I'm going to squeeze in another tip here planning each chapter with some extra buffer days, um, I think is really important. So, we always added 1 to 2 buffer days in each chapter because we knew that not every lesson goes the way that it is planned, right? We talked about those external forces. Students might be absent, you might be absent. So we all aimed for the same chapter test, the same day for the chapter test, knowing that we were all within 1 to 2 days of each other getting to that point. So that helped me to breathe a little more easily and not feel as beat.
Yeah.
So those would be my 2 tips. Plan backwards and give yourself some wiggle room within each chapter.
So I'm fascinated by this planning backwards because it seems counterintuitive.
Mm,
So just to clarify, so when you say plan backwards, you're talking about looking at, let's say, the end of the chapter, that assessment, and kind of analyzing what students should have mastered by then, and then planning out the lessons uh, to get there accordingly. Does that
Yeah.
sound right?
Yeah. And actually, I should clarify a little more. The other thing that we would also look at is the chapter learning targets. And we would actually provide students with those learning targets so that they could sort of self assess along the way. And they were aware of the mathematical ideas that they would be assessed on at the end of the chapter. So we would look at those learning targets. And again, this was to help us build familiarity, right? If we knew the learning targets, we knew where we were going and we knew where those learning targets appeared in each lesson, that would give us a more holistic view of the chapter, right? And help us with, I know me personally, if I knew, if I left, if we ended a lesson knowing that the kids didn't quite get to where they needed to be, but I knew they were going to see, revisit, build on that learning target in the next two lessons, that helped me breathe a little more easy. So just getting that view of the chapter, understanding how the math unfolds, understanding if there are any checkpoints within that chapter, helped us to plan those individual lessons. So,
Okay. I
yeah.
like it. Yeah, planning backwards. Never, like I said, I'm used to the chapter just being laid out, so you just follow it as is. So the idea of kind of starting at the end and then working your way backwards, understanding, I think that would help teachers understand, it would help narrow the focus, right? Because sometimes we can get lost, like, oh, well, this topic is introduced in this chapter, therefore students must achieve proficiency by the end of the chapter, when that's not always the case, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes topics are introduced, but that proficiency is developed over time and is actually not to be till a chapter or two later. So, yeah, that I think that idea of pacing from the end and working backwards can help really narrow that focus for teachers as well. So, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a colleague talked or sort of explained it as, just when you're traveling somewhere, your destination, right? And um, you use a map to get to it. But knowing that destination is really helpful, right? Sort of zooming out, knowing where you're going can help you with the journey to get there. So
Nice.
awesome.
I like that
All
visual.
right. So we're going to take an even bigger step back and think about the whole semester or trimester. But we're going to talk about long-term pacing. And so that brings its own challenges because we talked about the day-to-day disruption. But when you think long-term, you have to plan around uh, state testing and, um, just breaks in the calendar, all kinds of things. So I'm going to let you kick it off again, Adam. What is your best advice for planning for a semester?
So my this recommendation comes from just literally the years of frustration of not taking these things into account when I
Mhm.
was doing the original planning, and you kind of hinted at it already. But really, my biggest recommendation as you plan out the semester is you need to plan around the school site schedule,
Mm,
especially at the high school level. Like Bri, you mentioned earlier, the high school, there's so many different things going on. You have rallies and field trips and all this other stuff, especially at the secondary level.
yeah.
So as you think about your semester, I think it's important to go into the calendar and find some way to, whether it's color coding in Google Calendar or, highlighting whatever it is in a paper planner, but really find those days that are abnormal. And so I kind of came with a list, right, of some things. So rally days. Do you have assemblies? Is there going to be a fire drill? Things like that. Mm. Also, highlight the breaks. So I think of something like, a Labor Day, right? That Friday before Labor Day, you're probably not getting much done. The Tuesday after Labor Day, you're probably also not getting much done. So having those days highlighted and knowing when you're leaving for break, when you're coming for break, um, also as much as possible, and this one would always catch me off guard, is, you show up to class, or the class files in, and like a third to half the class is gone, and you're like, where is everybody? And you find out, oh, the English department went on this big field trip today. It's like,
Yeah.
well, now I have this lesson that, it doesn't feel right to do without half the class just because, that when the second half comes back in the next day, you're just playing catch up. So I think as you're planning out the semester, going through the school, sitting down with the school site calendar next to you and just really highlight those days, those abnormal days, those days that are not just, you're going to every period or you're attending every class, things like that. And just accounting for those. Like I said, like on a fire drill day, probably not the best day to get a full lesson done, right? And so just making those adjustments. Yeah. So planning around the school schedule. That's kind of my recommendation for pacing a summer or pacing a semester out.
I love that. And I needed to do that better. Those fire drills snuck up on me. Um, Another day I will add to the list of where you're not getting much done is the day after Halloween.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And actually, my district was really great, and they would try to plan a teacher work day for the day after Halloween each year. And so sometimes that worked out, sometimes it didn't, but it was always great just knowing that we had some time to ourselves to get things done, especially that October, because they say, October is one of those months you get through, March is one of those months you get through. So
Yeah.
yeah, so much to think about, especially in that secondary level where students are out with, like you said, the English department. Next thing you know, half your sixth period is out because they're all traveling for their sports. Um, for us, Dixon Mayfair week, bye. Half the school was gone because they were showing animals. So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, planning around that stuff, especially spring semester, gets busy. Um, yeah, take some time to look at your calendar and see what you can plan around. So,
Yeah.
love that. Thank you. Um, my recommendation for semester planning, we have already kind of touched on. I was thinking sort of in terms of how I get through all of the content. And that was a question that just came up a lot in my department, especially during our first years. And one of my colleagues who had taught CPM, he's a veteran CPM teacher, he would always stress to me, you got to move on and you've got to stick with the pacing. And you mentioned that early on. So my recommendation, which I think works for chapter pacing and semester pacing, is to just stick to the recommended pacing. And over the semester, I'm going to add, do not jump around in the curriculum, and especially if it's your first year.
Yeah.
So, whether or not you're using CPM or a different curriculum, every curriculum is designed intentionally, right? So, and when you move things around, um, you're not going to be able to maximize the benefits of the curriculum. And so, I can speak to CPM. CPM is designed with the idea of mastery over time. And mixed space practice being one of our foundational pillars. So, what that means is that students are getting times or opportunities to re-engage in concepts, because we know that students don't build understanding overnight, right? That takes time. They can probably do some mimicking and memorizing overnight, but really, real understanding takes time, right? So I remember my first couple of years teaching from the integrated one book and not fully understanding how concepts really unfolded the way that they did. And I would often add these little mini lessons or took an extra 1 to 2 days to teach a specific skill that I thought that students had to master before moving on.
Yeah.
Right. Kind of see you nodding your head there because I think we all kind of do that. Like, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, the example that comes to mind is trigonometry,
Mm-hmm.
because in our curriculum in integrated two, we introduce tangent and it's only tangent. And there is a tendency I've noticed with some teachers who just, they like the trig goes together. So instead
Yeah.
of, allowing tangent to just have, like you said, have room to breathe, because there are a lot of connections to tangent, right? Triangles and things like that. There's this almost like overwhelming feeling some teachers have, like, well, I gotta bring sine and cosine to the party as well. So Yeah, no, that one, what you're saying now hits home for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And you're right. Oftentimes, and especially in the integrated series where things are, really actually moved around to be more integrated, the math unfolds in a way that we're not used to, right? Another
Yeah.
example is our calculus course. Uh,
Mhm.
I don't know about you, but I remember when I took calculus, all of the derivative rules were taught together. And it was like derivatives were first semester calculus, with some integrals, and second semester calculus was integrals. But in our calculus book, that is not the case. And actually, students
Mhm.
don't learn derivative rules until later on. And it is so uncomfortable. And it's like, when are they going to learn these things? We have an AP test, but it actually unfolds very beautifully. And that's because students have so much time to build understanding early on. Um, so when I would, throw in these mini lessons, um, because I thought students needed to kind of master something, I'd get there, only to realize that um, the curriculum had already sort of intentionally built in time for students to learn this skill,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And so in trying to help them, I actually shortcutted that discovery process for them.
Right.
Right. So, um, my students would end up like memorizing an algorithm, which I mean, now they had an algorithm in their toolkit, which was great, but it wasn't as helpful when they were facing something like anything that was less familiar, right? Than
Yeah.
just like apply this algorithm. Right. So, um, the takeaway would be to just let the math play out as intended, right? Some
Yeah.
things might feel a little off or a little unclear, for both you and your students, but especially during that first year, give it a try.
Yeah.
And you can always go back and adjust. You know your students, your school site, your calendar, all those things. But to really understand the way the math unfolds, to understand your course, to understand the curriculum and the philosophy behind it. Um, my recommendation would be to just teach it as it's intended, right? It is written that way for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I 100% agree. Right. This whoever writes these curriculums, they're brilliant. Like to put it to put it mildly, right? Like they're just brilliant. The way that these topics unfold and the way that they spiral and lead into one another. So, it's like you said, it's important that we trust its design and the intentionality behind that design. Um, the one thing I would add is, and I'm just trying to be realistic, right? Let's say it's March. There's 12 chapters in the book, and you're in chapter 8 or 9. And it's like I said, it's March. You're looking at the schedule, and especially at the high school level, we got, seniors are doing their thing, getting ready to head out. You've got spring break, you've got testing, AP testing, all of those things.
Yeah.
So, one of the things because that is a realistic challenge. So, and I think one of the things that it might be important to do is kind of, around that February, March, kind of take stock of where you're at, and what are you realistically, given the amount of time left, what are you realistically going to get through, and start having those conversations with vertically among courses. So if
Yeah.
you're doing integrated one, start talking to those integrated two teachers, two, talk to three, and so on. Um, and just really kind of, understand what might not be covered, but also think about like, okay, maybe, is there a topic that we absolutely should cover, maybe, in that last month or so. Because I think that's just a realistic challenge of pacing out the semesters. You likely just don't, especially that first year, right? You just don't get to everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, don't do it alone. Have those
Right.
conversations, check in with yourself, check in with one another, hold each other accountable, um, so that we know that students are seeing their grade level material, right? Because that leads to an equity issue too, right? If some class periods are, some class sections are seeing the whole course, but some aren't seeing the other course or the whole course, then students aren't walking into the next course with the same ex- um, the same, I won't say experience, but the same amount of exposure, right? So we've got
Yeah.
to support each other when those kinds of things happen.
Yeah. No, that's a great
So
point. Yeah.
yeah. All right. So um This is a great episode of Some Shenanigans, but at the end of the episode, we always like to summarize things or sum things up. And Adam, I'm going to need your help with this because we've shared a lot of great tips. But to sum things up, we started off with lesson pacing, right? So we recommended using timers and sticking to those core problems or those problems that are going to support students the most in getting to that lesson objective. Moving on to chapter pacing, Adam brought up the importance of understanding um, sort of the level of mastery that students might need and being okay with students not reaching mastery towards maybe at the end of a lesson. Does that summarize it?
Nope.
Okay.
You're doing fantastic so far
Awesome.
in your summarization.
Love that. Okay, good. And we also talked about the idea of planning backwards and knowing where you're going so that the journey there, each lesson feels a little more comfortable, especially when students might not reach that level of understanding that you were expecting, right? Um, Last but not least, we move on to semester pacing. And this is where I'm going to need your help, Adam. Nope, I don't. Plan around school events, right? Plan around
Yep.
your school calendar, make notes for yourself, help yourself out, and be proactive about knowing what's coming up. You're not going to know everything, right? Students are going to be out on field trips that were planned last minute. Sometimes all these things aren't they're not always in our control, but we do know when testing is, right? We do know when those holidays are. So put those on your radar.
Yep.
And lastly, stick to the recommended pacing as much as you can, right? Give the curriculum a chance, give the math a chance to unfold in its intended way. How'd I
That
do?
was you get a gold star for the day, Bri. That was you have a much better memory than me. So
Well,
fantastic. That was awesome. Good
well,
job.
we're in my sweet spot from 9 a.m. to maybe 1 p.m.
Caffeine starts kicking in. Yep, we're good.
After that, who knows? But all right. So that is a wrap on our episode. And we're hoping that you walk away with some practical tips to make pacing feel a little less stressful, a little more intentional. Um, and so if this episode got you thinking, or if you have your own pacing tips, we'd love for you to share them. Please feel free to drop them in a comment below. And we'd love to hear from you. So please do not forget to subscribe. And maybe send this episode to a teacher friend who might be maybe trying to plan 30 lessons into 20 days. Who knows?
Ooh, I think we all know somebody like that.
And stay tuned for next time where we're going to be diving into a new topic. Adam, what are you going to be chatting about next time?
So the next topic we're going to be getting into is universal access. So it's just how do we enhance our instruction, our teaching, so that it helps to meet the needs of all learners.
Awesome. So you will not want to miss that. So thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Some Shenanigans.